Farmer Joe moved on after the missing of one of his cows. Sure, it had never happened before, and the circumstances very, to say the least, very suspicious. But he had a farm to run, and therefore no time to waste on looking for her. Then, out of nowhere, he finds his cow after 8 months. Upon coming closer to her, he wished he had found her much sooner. The nightmare of every farmer became a reality right then and there. Joe gasped when he looked at his cow. He hadn't seen her in 8 months, and frankly, she didn't look like his cow anymore. Her state was horrible. Joe was a very experienced farmer who had seen many things, but nothing like this. She had clearly gone through something very traumatic. But that wasn't all. There was no time to waste. He had to get his cow to safety as soon as possible. But there was something wrong. The cow acted almost unnaturally. It looked frightened, as if she didn't recognize Joe anymore. Joe knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and she would be gone again. Joe did everything in his power to save his cow, but nothing seemed to work. Joe didn't know what to do anymore. There has to be a way to get her away from here, he thought. And then he realized. But what happened to the cow in those 8 months? Why was Joe so shocked to see her? And why was there no time to waste? The first remarkable thing is not long in coming. Joe hears his phone ringing repeatedly, despite it being 5 a.m. However, he has his hands full at work and can't answer. Joe is a down-to-earth man and assumes that calls will be returned if it is really important. Joe was mistaken and would pay the price for it. The day continues as normal in the following hours. Joe works the land, eats his lunch at his usual time, and doesn't expect anything spectacular this day. Joe was a man of routine, so it was all the more surprising that 8 months earlier, a cow could just disappear. However, it would soon come to light. The phone rings again. This time, Joe has the opportunity to answer. He says hesitantly, "Hello, who is this? What can I do for you?" Joe is not used to being called. Then he hears a voice, which he seems to recognize. It's his old intern. Joe listens closely, as this intern was also working around the time the cow disappeared. But the intern doesn't seem to get to the point. He keeps asking courtesy questions and doesn't seem to want to say why he's calling. Then he interrupts him. "Why are you calling, Harry?" Harry then starts telling about a cow he saw standing near the swamp side of the woods. Joe doesn't know what he's hearing. He asks what the cow looked like and what it was like. He suggests going there that same day, but notices a certain fear in Harry. What could he be fearing? Harry does not respond to Joe's request to visit that day. He makes up an excuse, but Joe realizes there's a reason for it. Joe tries to reassure him by saying he can tell him anything. And then Harry finally becomes a little more honest. Harry says that it might not be as safe as you would expect. Joe doesn't understand, and is now losing his temper. He just wants to know what's up. Harry feels the pressure building and then does what he's been meaning to do for a long time. He hangs up the phone. Joe is left empty-handed, but knows what he has to do. Joe decides to go to the forest. The swamp side, how big can that be? He says to himself. Joe arrives at the forest and realizes it isn't going to be an easy job. The forest was huge, and Joe had greatly underestimated it. His search began, not knowing what awaited him. The forest is not how Joe remembered it from his childhood years. At the time, it was lively, full of animals, and very green. By now, it seemed deserted, and the trees were so bare that it seemed permanent autumn. He barely saw any animals, and some parts seemed more swamp than forest. A cow would therefore not be able to survive very long here. Joe has no concept of time. He doesn't have a mobile phone, and he left his watch on the farm. But a glance into the sky reveals that twilight is not long in coming. Joe must make a choice, or he'd go further into the dark, or return tomorrow with the idea that his cow would have to stay behind in the woods for another night. Joe returns home. He senses the ominous nature of the forest, and isn't even sure if Harry is even right about all of this. In Joe's opinion, it was safer to go home and return early tomorrow. What Joe failed to realize was that time was indeed a factor, and he had to use every minute. The next morning, after tending to his animals, Joe starts his quest again. Before that, he made another attempt to reach Harry, but that was in vain. So again, he has no idea where to look exactly, but this time luck would be on his side. because pretty soon after Joe goes into the woods, he sees something in the distance. There are some trees and a piece of land lined with ribbons. The animal service seems to be there, and when Joe looks closer, he sees a cow. What could be going on here? He doesn't wait any longer and sprints towards it, but before he gets close enough to see if it is indeed his cow, Joe is already stopped. It is an employee of the animal service who urgently tells him to keep his distance. Joe doesn't like this and immediately asks for the identity code on the cow's collar. Then he gets a surprising answer. The animal service employee says, "That is not important, sir. There is something going on here that is much more important than the ownership of the cow. I want to ask you to leave the premises." Joe can't believe it. He walks away from the employee, looking over his shoulder again. Then something strikes him, because as soon as he looks closely at the cow, he recognizes his own cow. The cow has the exact same head as his missing cow, and he recognizes her immediately. Joe now knows he needs to find a way to get closer so he can at least see what's going on. Legally or illegally, there had to be a way. Fortunately, the forest is big enough, and the animal service employees are only on one side of the ribbon. So if he were to walk around, Joe could reach his cow via a different route. He knew this wouldn't be appreciated, but at this point, he couldn't care less. Looking back, he had every reason to take this risk. And as Joe takes a detour to the cow, his thoughts turn to Harry. Because how did Harry know this? Why was he so desperate and anxious? Surely he could have just said that animal service was present. Joe didn't know Harry like this at all. There had to be something else. Joe's effort pays off. He has a view of his cow in the animal service, but this time from a completely different angle. He can therefore come closer and closer step by step, without being noticed. Things were about to unfold. Joe gets closer and closer, and sees that his cow's behavior is completely unnatural. He cannot comprehend it, and becomes more and more in a hurry to get closer. The animal service then notices him, but Joe doesn't care at this point. Joe figures that the guy from Animal Control is already too far behind him to catch him before he manages to get to his beloved cow. But what Joe did not know was that the guy was not alone. The scale of this operation was far greater than Joe could have ever imagined. When the animal service employee shouted, "Stop that man!" 3 other guys wearing the same animal control outfits suddenly appeared in Joe's view. How had he not seen them before? He knew that there was no way past these guys, so he stopped running and put his hands up. His cow was so close, and he could now even make out that the animal had been suffering. It did not look like that animal that had disappeared from his farm 8 months ago, but he could still recognize beyond any shadow of a doubt that it was his cow. It was luckily not like people from Animal Control could arrest him. Technically, he was not breaking any laws. He did not have to obey them, as it was not their land or their cow. But out here in the middle of the forest with nobody else watching, who knew what these guys were capable of, Joe knew he was better off cooperating with them. And that is what he started to try and do when the first guy he spoke to angrily approached him. He needed to work with these guys instead of against them, and so he started off with a heartfelt apology for rushing toward his cow. He then tried to explain his position and situation to them as best he could in the hope that they would feel some sympathy for him. And by them calming down their demeanor during the conversation, Joe could tell that his strategy was working. The animal control workers told Joe that they had been instructed not to let anybody near the cow until further notice. They were to make no expectations, so also not for the owner of the cow. But now they realized that Joe might be able to help them. They had only come across the cow themselves a couple of days ago. A hiker had seen the animal and called them as soon as he realized the concoction that it had been in. They had no way of knowing how long it had already been there, but they knew it had to be a while. Apparently, nearly all the grass that the animal had been able to reach had been eaten away, including all the plants. But still, the animal had lost a lot of weight and was struggling very much. It had been incredibly lucky that there was a good water source nearby. But Joe still had no idea why his cow had stayed in this position for so long, and he almost begged the animal service workers to tell him. They looked at each other for a brief moment, and Joe could sense that they were hesitant to tell him. But eventually, they decided to indulge him. While Joe expected to hear that the cow had stepped in a bear trap or something that made it impossible for the animal to leave, he actually got a very different explanation. According to the animal service employees, the animal was staying in this spot in the forest of its own free will. They told Joe that the animal was not alone in the forest. It had found something, and this was the reason it did not want to leave at any cost. It also did not want anybody to come anywhere near close to her. Now Joe was beyond curious as to what was happening. He needed to know what the hell his cow was protecting for so long in the forest. But the animal services were not planning on revealing this information to Joe. This was information that had to stay away from public knowledge as long as possible. This was his cow, and he actually had a way to prove this. The animal was burn marked and numbered, and he had all the documentation to prove it. It would only be a matter of horse before he could submit this information and have the local court come to a ruling. And if this would mean the animal service employees would be violating the law themselves by refusing him access to his property. When Joe started telling them this, he could see how angry they got that he had betrayed their trust. But they also realized that they had no other choice. Very much against their wishing, they allowed Joe to go near his cow as long as he did not touch whatever it was that she was protecting. They were very vocal about them hoping that his cope would just straight up attack him as he got closer like it always did to them. And as he got closer, he could see that his cow was reacting. He could read on her face that she was experiencing a mix of fear and anger. It was clear that she did not immediately recognize him, which was of course not that strange as she had been away for 8 months. And the cow actually did charge at Joe this first time he set foot in her area, which made him instantly take a couple of steps back. But then something seemed to change in the behavior of the animal. It seemed to calm down. Could it have finally recognized him? Joe made a second approach, and this time his cow seemed to welcome him almost. The animal service employees were looking at the situation from a distance in disbelief. How did this disrespectful farmer manage to pull this off? But when Joe saw what his cow had been protecting here all this time, it suddenly made all the sense in the world. Why the cow ran away, why it had been so aggressive to anybody that came close, why the animal service employees wanted to keep this a secret, and why the cow was fine with having him here. Below the cow, there was a small wolf cub drinking milk from the animal's udders. Joe knew that the wolf was a very protected and rare species in these areas that most farmers, including him, wanted to see completely gone due to the animal killing their livestock. Seeing as the wolf was without a mother, chances were that it was killed by one of the farmers, and the cub would most likely die alone in the wild. But by some stroke of luck and motherly intuition, his cow had found the wolf cub and decided to take care of it. The cow had lost one of her calves right before the animal decided to run away, and maybe she saw the wolf cub as a replacement for her own child. But now that the wolf cub was nearly big enough to face the world without being milk-fed, the animal service employees could finally act. They caught the wolf calf and let it grow up in protected care before releasing it back into the wild where it would be no target for angry farmers. Joe could take his cow home and nurse it back to health. A happy ending for everybody involved.